This week we're going to look at chapters 2 and 3 from Bonhoeffer's Discipleship. I know we had said that we were only going to look at 2, but 3 is so closely connected to 2, and it's actually fairly brief. Single-minded obedience is pretty short in terms of a chapter, so I thought I'd cover them together. Obviously, when you have a chance, go on and read chapter 3, 2. But I'm gonna talk about 2 and 3 in this little brief presentation. But before I do that, I want to look back at chapter 1. Just do a real quick cursory look at chapter 1. The opening line to chapter 1 is pretty significant. It actually sets the thesis for where Bonhoeffer is going to go in the book as a whole. Bonhoeffer says that cheap grace is the deadly enemy of our church. We're fighting today for costly grace. That's the translation in the older version, the one that I dropped in the course, so I'm going to read from it today. He then goes on to talk quite a bit about cheap grace and costly grace and the difference between the two, and he uses the monastic movement, medieval monasticism, as an example of what costly discipleship looks like. Monasticism, of course, was the medieval movement to purify what was seen to be the excesses of the church, and to do so through obedience and chastity and prayer, poverty, denying yourself. And as Bonhoeffer understands it, because Luther was a monastic or started out as a monastic, Luther takes that monasticism and builds it into the Reformation. And instead of having, kind of professional prayers, you now have anybody can take up their cross and follow Jesus in their daily life and do what it is that Jesus does in the Gospels, to literally be conformed to Jesus. Discipleship, as he puts it, is so closely related to grace that you can't separate the two. Discipleship is costly, but it's also grace. It begins with grace. It begins with the call of Jesus, follow me. And it becomes costly because of what it asks us to do, to give up everything to follow Jesus. And that discipleship, that following after, patterning our lives after Jesus, becoming Jesus Christ in the world with our own hands and feet, is costly because it asks us to give up so much of our own comfort, so much of what we want. It asks us to surrender to His will. And contrary-wise, for Bonhoeffer, cheap grace is the grace of those German Christians. Cheap grace is this idea that once you get your salvation, that's it. There are no other demands placed on you. Once you're saved, that's kind of it. I mean, that's as far as grace needs to go. And Bonhoeffer has a really important quote in chapter 1. Leaving the following of Christ to legalists, Calvinists, enthusiasts, we justified the world and condemned as heretics those who tried to follow Christ. In other words, cheap grace, the grace of the German church, justifies the world. It proclaims salvation. And it condemns anybody who engages in that costly grace. That's the church struggle. Cheap grace will always be oppressive toward costly grace. Moving on to chapter 2, Bonhoeffer has the most important statement in chapter 2 pretty early on. He says that you can only learn what obedience is by obeying. It is no use asking questions. It is only through obedience that you come to learn the truth. The idea here is that if you're going to follow Jesus, you follow. It doesn't require of you that you confess your sins. It doesn't require of you that you have faith. What is required of you is your obedience. In the act of obeying, you demonstrate what it is that you believe. You believe Christ in following Him. And it's only then through that obedience that you come to learn the truth. The disobedient will never believe, and believers will never be disobedient. What this does, of course, is it directly challenges some of the fundamental tenets of traditional Lutheranism. The call of Jesus goes out, that's the grace, and it must be followed by the response of obedience. Now, traditional Lutherans will say, well, that's just not true. The call of grace goes out, and it is that grace that saves you. It is nothing you do. It's nothing you don't do. Obedience is not in any way for traditional Reformed Lutheranism. It's not in any way connected to salvation. And Bonhoeffer says that's just not true. The response of the disciples when Jesus says, "Follow me," is itself an act of obedience. They drop their nets and they follow. The response of disciples, interestingly enough, at least in the Gospels, is not a confession of faith. The confession of faith only happens in the act of following. So in that way, grace will inevitably, in Bonhoeffer's mind, lead to obedience. And obedience is made possible by that grace, which will then spur you on to further obedience. The cycle here is, it begins with God. God is the one who intervenes. God is the one who speaks into the darkness and proclaims the light. And all we can do is respond. All we can do is be obedient to that which we have heard Jesus say. That's contrary to the way in which the German Christians thought about grace. It's contrary to the way in which the German Christians thought about salvation. Interestingly enough, a lot of American churches have more similarities to German Christians than we do to Bonhoeffer. One of the most important books that will take up this theme that we're going to catch in Discipleship is a book by Stan Hauerwas and Will Willimon from 1989 called Resident Aliens. And in that book, they said the church just isn't different enough from the world. And we look so much like the world that they don't really have a lot of reason to believe that there's any difference in us. And therefore, there's no real reason for them to want to be Christians. Um, I saw this countless times in the church as pastor. It's what I call practical atheism. When a church goes to make a decision, they make the decision as if their decision is what will spur on the church. Uh, for example, I recall sitting really not so long ago in an evangelism committee. And that evangelism committee was debating what sort of flyer they should put out for the church in the community to try to get people to come to church. And so they're debating the different kinds of flyers that they can put out, the size, the wording, the formatting, the design. And I'm just sitting there listening to what this evangelism committee is saying. We want to draw people into the church, and of course the best way to do that is to create a flyer and put that out in the community, and if it's the right kind of flyer, we'll get people in. Where's the problem with that? As I see it, and I think Bonhoeffer sees it, the problem with that is we operate as if God doesn't really make a difference. If Bonhoeffer's right, and Jesus is already at work in the world to call people to himself, we need to encourage that obedience and not worry about the little things like whether or not we get the design of the flyer right. As I posed it to that evangelism committee, the problem isn't the flyer. The problem is we're operating as if God isn't already involved, as if God is not already in the world calling people to himself in Jesus Christ, and urging the church then to be obedient and go and do that. Call people to discipleship. Chapter 2 challenges this idea that grace alone saves you. This monergistic notion that God's activity in the world is not related in any way to our response. And as Bonhoeffer sees it, that's just simply not true. When Jesus calls, the only response is to follow. The only response is obedience. The Latin root there is literally to hear, to listen, and to respond. So obedience then grows out of that grace, grows out of that call. The call precedes everything. The grace comes first. There is no activity of God in the world without it is the call of Jesus Christ to the world, follow me. And then it falls to us to do just that, to follow. But as Bonhoeffer sees it in chapter 2, there are two very wrong paths that you can take. Only those who believe obey is what we say to that part of a believer's soul which obeys. And only those who obey, believe, is what we say to that part of the soul of the obedient which believes. The first half of the proposition, if the first half of the proposition stands alone, only those who believe obey, the believer is exposed to the danger of cheap grace, which is another word for damnation. Salvation without change. If the second half, only those who obey believe, stands alone, The believer is exposed to the danger of salvation through works, which is another word for damnation. So the tightrope to walk here is between cheap grace and salvation through works. God's call in Jesus Christ to follow is itself the inbreaking of grace into the world. Jesus Christ is the incarnation of God's grace. And the call of that grace into the lives of human beings is itself an act of grace. But the response to that call is not simply that we believe. It's that we obey. But that obedience doesn't come up from within ourselves. We're not conjuring up the power to do it. The obedience happens because that grace has so infiltrated our world, has so infiltrated our lives, that we are compelled to follow Jesus. We are compelled into obedience. And this is a way of understanding salvation that I think a lot of people miss in its nuances. Because Bonhoeffer is fundamentally a theologian of grace. Absolutely 100%. God is at work in the world. No doubts. God is at work in the world. God is at work in the world in Jesus Christ, the incarnate one, to call people to follow. The call is grace. The response is obedience. Because in the obedience, we demonstrate that which we believe. If you want to know what a Christian believes, don't look at what they say. Look at what they do. Look at the way in which they pattern their lives after Jesus Christ in obedience. Because if that's not there, it's either cheap grace or it's salvation by works. And those are the twin ditches to avoid. They're very wrong paths that the German church could go down. Either they could go down the road of cheap grace, which a lot of them were doing, or they can go down the road of salvation through works, doing the right things, making sure I've ticked off all the right boxes, whether that's I said the sinner's prayer, I confessed with my mouth, and I went forward at church, and I got baptized, and now I'm saved. And I did all those things. That's my salvation. Both of those are damnation. Both of those are a failure to follow Jesus Christ. And he uses in the chapter the example from Matthew 19, which is the story of the young man who comes to Jesus and says, you know, I want to follow. I just want to know, you know, what I should do. Tell me, you know, what do I got to do to justify myself? Well, do I keep the law? And that's what I call loophole discipleship. I'm looking for a loophole. Discipleship is not something we do when we have nothing else to do. Discipleship is what we do when we hear Jesus call. That is the response to Jesus' call. And Jesus bids this young man to embrace voluntary poverty, and when he does, he's presenting the young man with an alternative. And that alternative is between his old life and his new life. Because to follow Jesus Christ is to drop the nets and to engage in a whole new life with a new relationship to God, a new story of who you are in a new world where God is active and prevalent everywhere. This notion of discipleship as obedience presents us with the possibility that there is nowhere Jesus has not already gone. Jesus is already at work in the world and calls us to go out into it. In chapter 3, the primary idea in single-minded obedience is that those who follow, those who obey, will be single-minded in their obedience. To quote Bonhoeffer here, Jesus might say, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God," and we should interpret it thus: of course we should have to seek all these other things first. How could we otherwise exist? What he really means is the final preparedness to stake all on the kingdom of God. All along the line, we're trying to evade the obligation of single-minded literal obedience. We find all sorts of rationalizations to keep ourselves from that single-minded, focused only on the words of Jesus to us, to act differently in the world. We find ways around that. And obedience proclaims to the world there is only one voice we listen to. And that voice is Jesus Christ. And it is a concrete obedience to Jesus Christ. We're not talking in the abstract. We're talking about in the daily life of those who have heard Jesus Christ call to them, "Follow me." It will require of us very specific, concrete responses, such as caring for the poor, delivering the oppressed, guarding the Jew, speaking up for those who have no voice. The single-minded obedience is a direct challenge on the way in which we think of salvation. Because it says there is no excuse for shrinking the necessity of concrete obedience. What does that concrete obedience look like now? Well, it can be something so simple as protesting outside the governor's office when there's a state-sponsored murder of a man on death row. It can be speaking up for the poor in the community by engaging in acts of kindness and care and concern. Engaging in a Black Lives Matter march. That kind of concrete obedience says Jesus Christ has made a claim on our lives here, now, where we are. And that claim will have one and only one true response: obedience. And not just any obedience, but the concrete obedience of a disciple in the world where they are. Just as God was active in the life of Jesus Christ where he was, God is active in the lives of those who follow Jesus Christ in our world. And that involvement, that divine action in the world and in us makes very specific claims on who we are and what we do. This is why when Bonhoeffer runs away to the United States in 1939, he cannot stay. He has security, he has safety, he even has a job lined up. And once he lands on that boat lands in New York Harbor, it's only a matter of a couple of weeks before God has so pricked his conscience that he has no choice but to go back, knowing full well when he goes what the Nazi government thinks of him and what his end will be. The only hope that Bonhoeffer had in returning was the hope of a Christian community strong enough to support his resistance, strong enough to make his own concrete obedience possible. And he did not have that support. He did not have that community, which says concrete obedience will not happen in isolation from others. Discipleship, Christian discipleship, is inevitably communal. It is inevitably corporate. There are no Lone Ranger disciples. The reason Bonhoeffer ultimately failed in his resistance was because there was not that community that made that kind of concrete obedience possible. This is why people who want to pick up this book need to be incredibly careful not to individualize what Bonhoeffer says. Bonhoeffer's vision of discipleship, as I'll argue in my dissertation, is inevitably churchly. It requires the support of a Christian community that makes that concrete obedience possible. So where do we see that in our own context? More often than not, I will venture to say, you don't see it in American churches. Because I wholeheartedly believe that American churches are more like German Christians than we want to admit. which makes the appeal of this book all the more ironic. Where do we see that here? Now. Where do we hear Jesus' call to follow now? Here, in our own place, in our own time, as obedient disciples. The answer to that question is not simple, but it is a question we as obedient disciples living in a concrete situation have to answer. Where do we hear the call of Jesus? Follow me. And will our response be that of obedience? Or will it be that of cheap grace? Or will it be that of salvation by works? Those are the options. You got the twin ditches into which you fall, and single-minded, concrete obedience. Which will it be?